It's really fun to say, but for the first time ever, I want to welcome you to Venture Church. It was about 15 years ago that a group of 20-somethings hung out with me in my living room in Modesto, California. There's about 50 of us, and we began to pray about this new church that we were all going to launch together in the Seattle area. And I remember when I felt like the Lord said, Brandon, I want you to give your 30s to church planning. I was 32 years old, and I fought it like crazy. I did not want to plant a church. I knew all the stats, and I had had several friends that had tried. And 15 years ago, church planting wasn't as prominent as it is today. I mean, now there's examples of successful church plants all over, but back then, they failed way more often than they succeeded. In fact, the statistic was that only 1 out of every 10 church plants made it 2 years. And I had had friends that had started churches and it hadn't worked out. And not only did their church end up closing their doors, but they ended up like really bitter with ministry and didn't want anything to do with ministry again. So I fought like crazy to not plant a church. The other hard part about planting a church back then is established churches felt very threatened by church plants. So if you were a church planter, you were almost kind of isolated away from other pastors because you were seen as a little bit of an anti-establishment rebel. So this whole process of choosing to plant this church was something that my wife and I wrestled through like crazy because for us, it looked like it was going to end up really lonely and potentially disastrous for our finances. I mean, most church planters, they ended up in poverty. So we fought it like crazy. But eventually, we got to this point where we went back to the call of God on our life. And when we were both called into ministry, our attitude was, Jesus, whatever you want us to do and wherever you want us to go, we'll go. And so we accepted the call of God to plant a church. But honestly, I was afraid. And the biggest thing I was afraid of is I could not wrap my brain around how much money we had to raise. You see, we had a target goal that before we launched the church, we would raise $250,000. Now, trying to raise that right now is complicated, but trying to raise that 15 years ago in a culture that was almost anti-church plant, it was not easy. And so what I did is I would travel on Sundays. My pastor at the church that I was an associate at said for 6 months, you don't need to be here on Sunday. You can just travel and raise money. I was the youth pastor, so he really wanted me during the week for our youth services, but he gave me the freedom to travel every weekend. And so I would travel around to churches and I would share the vision of this church that I was going to start. And then we would take an offering after the service, and the goal was to see if we could accumulate about $250,000 in that 6-month period of time. There was one particular church that I had the privilege of speaking at, and it's when I knew God was in this thing. It was when I knew that this wasn't going to be easy, but this journey was really the will of God and the church that we were launching, that this was something that God was going to bless. And it was this little tiny church in Idaho. And it was winter time, so it was super cold in Idaho. And I was from Modesto, California, which, 100 degrees is normal. And I was sick for the first time in years. In fact, I wasn't just sick. I had bronchitis and pneumonia at the same time. You might be wondering, well, why didn't you cancel? And that's because it was really hard to get bookings with churches because they were reluctant to have a guy come in who was simply going to speak and take an offering for something he was doing. So every Sunday I was able to book out was precious. And even though I was sick, I had to speak. And so I arrived in this town and I was speaking at their 3 services the next morning. But because I was so sick, I couldn't sleep all night long. I was just coughing and I was cold and I had the shakes and I was alone and miserable. And I cannot paint how terrible that motel room was. And it was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I just gave up trying to sleep and I started pacing around praying. And in that moment, the Lord spoke to me one of the messages that I have shared many times over the years. And it's when I wrote at 3 in the morning at that motel room at that little town in the middle of nowhere in Idaho, where I wrote our seed time and harvest message. And I shared that in front of the church. I was barely able to get that out over those 3 services. After the service, they took me to lunch at the Mexican restaurant across the street. And I will never forget the church treasurer running in with tears in his eyes, handing an envelope to the pastor saying, "Pastor, it was a miracle. We took the largest offering in the history of our church." And I remember when he handed me that envelope, and I wasn't sick enough to open the envelope, and I opened it up and I was shocked by how much money that church in Idaho was willing to cede to a church planter from California who was planting a church in Seattle. And you know the coolest part of that story is 10 years later, that church in Idaho became our Venture Church Palouse campus. When I look back at this journey, I am thankful. I am grateful. And over the next month, me and several of our pastors are going to talk about the virtues of our church. And gratitude is an important virtue. And gratitude is this state of being grateful. And I think it's important to be thankful and to show gratitude. But I actually believe that the virtue of honor is even more important. You see, honor is the recognition of importance. It is the recognition of value. Honor is giving extravagant respect to an individual, an organization, a movement, whatever it is. And I want to publicly honor Pastor Glenn Berteau. He was my pastor in Modesto, California, that allowed me to serve on his staff for 6 months as I traveled around the country preaching at other churches, raising money for that. I will always honor Pastor Berteau, and he will always be my pastor. And to this day, I've led Canyon Creek for 15 years. I haven't been on staff with him for 15 years, but every time I see him, I still call him Pastor Berteau. And I do that out of honor. And on today, our 15th anniversary as a church, our 15th birthday, mine and my wife's 15th year leading this church, what I want to take the next several moments and do is I just want to honor. I want to honor people. I think the virtue of honor has been lost in the church in America. Now, we used to do a really good job of honoring people, but because people started expecting to be honored and because there was an abuse of honor, what ended up happening is we just kind of threw out, per se, the baby with the bathwater. But I want us as Venture Church, as we move forward in this new season, I want us to bring back the virtue of honor. Paul said in Romans, he said, you should show honor to whom honor is due. And so today, I want to honor people. And there's really 5 people that I want to take the next several moments and just honor. Because I realize that I would not be preaching on our 15th birthday as a church if it was not for these individuals. It's because of these people that I'm even here doing what I'm doing today. Our mission statement for our church has been live by faith, be a voice of hope, and be known by love. People, whenever they hear that, assume that we got it from 1 Corinthians 13, but our mission statement actually came from 1 Thessalonians 1, 2, and 3. And this was Paul writing a letter to the church in Thessalonica. He had started this church. He'd established this church. And it was years later, and he was sending a letter back to communicate to this body of believers in this church that he had founded years before. And here's what he said. He said, "I always thank God for all of you and continually remember you in my prayers." He said, "I remember before our God and Father, your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love, and your endurance inspired by hope in the Lord Jesus." And I always think, isn't it amazing that when Paul thinks of the experience that he had starting that church, he's overwhelmed by love and honor and gratitude and thankfulness for the people that were a part of that church. And first and foremost, that's who I want to honor. Church, I want to honor you guys. There is a group of you in particular that have been here for over 10 years. And I want to honor the people of this church. And I want you to know that when I think of you with as much fondness as Paul thought of the church in Thessalonica. And I'll tell you, 15 years, this has been an adventure. It has been a crazy journey. It's had ups and downs. It has had victories and defeats. And there are a lot of you that have just been faithful. And you have just said, as we are committed, we are a part of this church. We're committed to this body, this family, this vision, this mission, this place. We understand that it's not easy, but we are committed to this. And I just want to say that I honor you guys. And when I think about the people in our church, I'm like Paul. I want to say, I thank God for your work produced by faith. You could not be a part of this church for even 5 years if you weren't willing to live by faith. I thank God when I think of your labor prompted by love. You could not be a part of this church if you didn't understand mission. Because at Canyon Creek, we want to be known by love. We want to be hospitable and love each other and love our communities. And in addition, when I think of you, I think of your hope inspired by Jesus. And we always say we want to be a voice of hope. But think of how many risky ventures that we have been on together, where we have just kind of stepped out in faith, hoping Jesus was going to do something. So I have a gift for all of you, and the ushers at our various campuses are going to hand out that gift right now. And what that gift is, on our central campus property, you have the opportunity anytime to come, no matter when it is during the week. If you have friends or neighbors or anyone that you know that needs prayer. And it really was kind of a tribute not only to our church and our history, but also all of our experiences in Israel. Because whenever you go to Israel, you see a monument, you see a church that was established to remember a significant moment. And throughout that property, we have little monuments, little altars that we've set up to remember these significant moments in our history and the things that God has done. And every single one of them has attached to them a virtue, whether it be faith or love or miracles, whatever it is. And at each one of those stations, you are invited to pray. And to pray for those things. And you're invited to do that at any moment. And I'm excited to present that to you. And today, on our 15th birthday, thank you for being a part of our church. Thank you for serving. Thank you for giving. Thank you for supporting. Thank you for believing in our mission and our vision. And I, as your pastor, honor you. Our hope for the prayer venture is that anytime you are sensing, I need prayer, or I just want to appreciate everything that Jesus has done in my life and in our family and in our church, that you would take that map and walk the steps of that prayer venture, and at every spot, reflect on all of the miracles that you've experienced and our church has experienced, and then pray for what you are hoping for in the future. The second person or group that I want to honor is I want to honor this staff. The staff that is serving at my church right now. Now, in our history, we have had extraordinary leaders. And part of what has allowed Canyon Creek to make it 15 years and become Venture Church is because we've had an extraordinary group of pastors over the years. And they are out now leading incredible churches around the country. They're serving, doing amazing things at other places. And I love them and I'm grateful and thankful for them. But I really honor the staff that I have right now. And church, I don't want to downplay how challenging the last 3 years have been. I would say they've been the most challenging in our church's history. Canyon Creek has always been this crazy adventure, but when we finally decided to go all in as an organization, as a group of believers, and build this central campus, the last 3 years have been hard. One of the messages that I've taught many times over the years is I've taught on the principle of the in-between. And the in-between is we kind of live from a promise that God gave us and seeing God fulfill it, but we spend most of our time in the in-between, kind of in between a promise and its fulfillment. And there's nothing more challenging than living in the in-between. And I felt like these last 3 years have been the in-between. I honor the people that have stuck with this church and saw this thing through. 2020, it's going to be a piece of cake to work at this church. We have great facilities across all of our campuses. We have a bright future, but the last 3 years has been 3 years of my campus pastors trying to lead campuses with incredible financial restrictions because most of our resources were going to build this building. I've had staff that have had to navigate their various ministries without the simplest tool that every pastor at every other church has, and that's a facility to have meetings. And I think of our youth pastor that's had to move his youth ministry and stay encouraged and keep encouraging his youth leaders from all these different places he's had to move. I have a kids pastor that every single Sunday morning has to set up every one of his kids' room, minister to 200 to 300 kids every single weekend, and then tear those rooms down week in and week out. Imagine trying to do worship rehearsals without a building to do them. And I am really thankful for this staff and the fact that they have stuck with it. I'm thankful for these campus pastors and their willingness to stick with this. We had our Reach meeting recently, and a Reach is our missions program at our church. And one of the owners of our church showed me a picture on his phone, and it was from Pastor's Appreciation Sunday. Here's the picture. When he showed me this picture, he said, "Brandon," He said, I've loved our staff through the years. And he'd been at the church probably for 12 years. And he said, but I really love this staff. He said, this is an amazing staff. And these people will forever have a special place in my heart because they served when it wasn't easy to serve. And this past week, I presented our campus pastors and all my staff a gift, which they've all been given. But in addition to that, on our property, there is a tree that is planted in honor of their families. So you can see on our church's website the location of the tree that is planted to honor all of these staff. And to my staff, I just say, I love you guys. Thank you guys. To Pastor Dan, to Pastor Scott, you guys are literally my heroes. That you guys have been with us through this challenging season. And I want to promise you, as we begin to be Venture, it's going to be good. And I'm excited that you guys are a part of it. I also want to honor today, I want to honor our key lay leaders. These elders, these trustees, these deacons, these key leaders, everything I just said about the staff, I say about them also. Paul said in the book of Galatians, he said, let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time we'll reap a harvest if we do not give up. And I want to say to our elders that have stuck with us through all of these buildings, through all of these fundraising campaigns, who have given generously, who have served without expecting any reward from that at all, that have just done it selflessly. Honestly, guys, gals, I thank you guys. I actually, specifically, there's just a couple that I want to just thank publicly, and they are going to hate that I'm doing this, but I want to show honor to who honors due. I want to thank Aaron Falk. Many of you don't know Aaron, but Aaron is my longest standing board member. And Aaron has served as our treasurer, and now he just serves as just a regular board member. But Aaron is a partner at a very large accounting firm, so he has a really busy job. He is a family man. He's deeply invested in the community. He coaches kids sports, and he never misses elder meetings. He is always available for me to call him. And the thing I would say about Aaron is why I honor him so much. When this has gotten hard, Aaron has always been my friend. He's always believed in this church. He's always believed in the mission of this church and in the vision of this church. And there are times when I wanted to give up, and Aaron would be like the voice of reason, and he would say, we can do this, Brandon. We can do this. We're going to do this. And I think whenever you see Aaron, you should honor Aaron, because I would say Aaron's voice on our board is probably in influence equal to mine. And he is an extraordinary leader, and I want to honor him, and he is going to hate the fact that I just did that. I also want to just take a moment and honor Daniel Carpenter. And Daniel has a really special place in my life because I met Dan 14 years ago, and Dan was a pagan. That's no other way to put it. When I think of sin, I think Dan was consistently committing every one of them simultaneously, and he was pretty proud of it. But I started meeting with him every single week in the hopes that maybe this guy would get legitimately saved. And he kept wanting to meet with me, so I kept meeting with him, even though it was insanely frustrating, because he just embraced his carnalness and how sinful he was. In fact, he loved to boast to me about it. And every time I would think, I'm never meeting with this guy again, I would have this voice of the Holy Spirit that would say to me, if you stop meeting with him, who else will? And so I would continue to meet week in and week out. It got to the point, I'm not joking, that if I would have made a list of the least likely people to ever get saved, I'd have put Daniel Carpenter number one on that list. I had staff people that would meet with me and say, Brandon, this is a waste of time. Why are you doing this? There's all these other people you could be meeting with, but you meet with this guy every single week. Give it up. And I finally got to the point about 6 years ago where I was done. I couldn't handle it anymore. And just when I was about ready to stop meeting with Dan, the Holy Spirit got a hold of his life. And the Daniel that leads our Celebrate Recovery, that we were honored to ordain as a pastor in August, that was the beginning of Dan Carpenter becoming Daniel Carpenter. And over the years since then, Daniel reminds me constantly that Jesus changes lives. He reminds me of why I started this church. My wife and I sacrificed so much to do this because we were believing for lots of Daniel stories. And when I see Daniel leading, and I think he's one of the most hands down extraordinary leaders in our church. When I see him impacting so many people in our church through our Celebrate Recovery, I just am so proud of him. And whenever I have been bummed out, he's always just been a sounding board. He is loyal and trustworthy, and you can share things with him, and he maintains them in confidence. And most of all, Dan loves our church and the people in our church. And I just want to honestly, publicly honor Daniel, but I want to honor all of the elders, all of the trustees, all the deacons, all the key leaders in our church. When I think of our 15-year history, I couldn't have done this without you. And I wish I could tell a story about every one of you and take me to coffee. I'll pay. And I would love to just tell you what I love about you so much. I just want to take a moment and I want to honor my family. And I really do honor my wife. She has been hands down the best partner that I could have asked for in all of this. Through all the staff transitions that I've had over the years, the best thing in the world is that the best staff person we've ever had at this church, the person that loves the people in the church even more than I do, that believes in the church more than I do, the best thing in the world is knowing that she's married to me, so I don't ever have to worry about her transitioning. So she has always been there, and I'm really proud that she's my wife. I'm proud of what an extraordinary minister that she is. And our church is what it is because of Di and her influence. And I want to honor her. I also just want to honor my kids. Being a pastor's kid is not easy. Being a pastor's kid of a church planner is really stressful. Being a pastor's kid of a church planner who's had to do 3 capital campaigns and has moved 7 different buildings, and it's not easy. But my kids are probably the thing in this world that I'm the most proud of, and I absolutely love my kids. And my favorite thing is that now they're adults. They are incredibly driven. They're each successful in their own right, and all 3 of them are just unique individuals. But my favorite thing about my kids is that through everything that we've been through with this church, my kids still love me. And they want to hang out with me. And that my kids love Jesus, and they want to be heavily involved in church, and they want to make an influence for the kingdom of God. And then I love the fact that in spite of all the challenges, my kids love this church. And they want their families to be a part of this church. They want to be leaders in this church someday. So everything that happens with Canyon Creek, now Venture, my kids have been excited about. They are so excited about this name change. They are so excited about this building. Anytime my kids come home from school, my boys, the first thing they want to do is go tour the church building. And I really honor my family, and we couldn't have done what we've done. I couldn't have done it without them and their support. Lastly, the person that I want to honor the most, hands down, is Jesus. Paul said, I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus. Church, look around. Our Everett building, everything that's happened there. Our Palouse campus, everything that's happened there. Our Costa Rica campus, our online campus, our central campus, all of this has happened because Jesus is faithful. Because God is faithful to fulfill his promises, that he keeps his word, that 15 years ago, God said, go, I will bless it. We got the promise, we lived in the in-between, but we've all been able to experience the fulfillment. Honestly, if 15 years ago, that group of 50 people sitting in my living room would have known that 15 years later, we'd have all these campuses and over 2,000 people and these buildings and all these lives that have been changed, we would have said, yes, we'll do it. But we didn't really know. We just knew that what God was going to do was going to be good. And every challenge that we've had as a church, God has been faithful. And when I look back at these 15 years, this is what I hope for those of you that have been around for a while have experienced too. That when you are in the will of God and you're willing to take steps of faith for the purpose of mission, God moves mountains. That he does just crazy things. I hope that our 15-year history has shown you that the gospel changes lives. That the same Jesus that changed your life can change your family, that he can change your friends, that he can change your coworkers, that he can touch your neighbors. Our 15-year history has shown me that we can win the cities where our campuses are at. And that is because we serve a good God. This has shown me when Paul said God is able to do immeasurably more than you ask or imagine. That's what I believe he's done. He's done immeasurably more. So how do we honor Jesus? I mean, when we look back at these 15 years, I thank you guys for the presents. My staff thanks you. Everything's great. But we really need to honor Jesus. How do we thank him? How do we honor him? I think there's something that we can do in the future, and there's something that we can do in the present. And I want to start with the future. How do we honor Jesus? For the last couple of years, our Everett campus has been focused on buying a building, remodeling a building. Our Palouse campus has been focused on remodeling their facility. And the Central campus has been focused on building their building. And I think we honor Jesus by realizing that those were never meant to be clubhouses. That those buildings are meant to be community centers. Now that our buildings are done, we honor Jesus by filling these buildings. We honor Jesus by inviting our friends and our neighbors and our coworkers. When we give you a challenge like we're going to do today, who are your top 3 people that you are going to bring in December? That we actually do that we realize that if we don't invite people to experience the same relationship with Jesus that has changed us, our buildings are nothing more than clubhouses. And we didn't invest all this time, money, resources, energy to building a clubhouse. Let's fill these buildings and see lives radically changed. And finally, how do we honor Jesus now? Well, we're going to receive communion on our 15th birthday, on the day we become Venture Church. We're going to honor Jesus by remembering his sacrifice for us.